So, I'd like now to introduce Yogaratna, who's going to give us our first talk. Yogaratna lives in Cambridge, although he actually learned to meditate in Brighton in 1992 at the old Brighton Buddhist Centre. He was taught by Karanavira to meditate. He then moved to West London and was ordained in 2003. And then he moved to Cambridge in 2004, where he lives today. And Yogaratna's very keen on yoga, I believe. He's also written a book recently, which you can actually access on the BuddhistCentre.com website under the 2018 BAM thread. He's written a book, Breaking the Silence, Changing the Story, Buddhism versus Neoliberalism, which I've started sort of dipping into. It looks very interesting. And Yogaratna and I sort of met in the October Rebellion in London, the Extinction Rebellion, so sort of crossed our paths then. So I'm very much looking forward to his talk this evening. So I'll hand over to him.
Thanks, Shans Chitta. Thanks for lovely guided meditation. So, yes, I live in Cambridge. And recently I went for a walk along the River Cam in Cambridge with my partner, Johanna. It was a hot, sunny day, but there's a cool breeze. And I hadn't come prepared for swimming, but I suddenly decided I just couldn't resist a swim. I had swum here before, so I knew it was safe. I put my feet in, and it was really very cold. And I sort of gently put most of my legs in, and my feet were sinking into the deep clayey ooze, and it was still very, very cold. Johanna told me to just dive in. I said I'd have a heart attack. I tried splashing myself with the water, and I gasped. It's very cold water. I decided eventually that I'd probably survive, and I just plunged in. After the first shock, it was definitely cold, but very nice. There's something about having my eyes very near surface level of a river, sun on ripples coming straight towards me, brilliant blue dragonflies, water lilies resting on the water surface, seeing tiny fish shoaling away from me, treading water out of my depth, but feeling the tickle of water weeds on my feet. So it felt like I was swimming in something alive. Now, you know, the River Cam is both a beautiful natural phenomenon, and it's also a very managed river, as you might expect. In some places, it seems almost like a canal. Apparently, in recent years, it's been suffering from low water levels, partly because of declining rainfall, actually, but mainly because of over-extraction, so taking too much water out for drinking and agriculture. So that, you know, the over-extraction combined with some waste going into the river, that's apparently threatening the Cam's health as a river. It's threatening its biodiversity. So I'm using the Cam as an example, of course. It's a beautiful natural phenomenon. It nourishes us psychologically, I'd say even spiritually, and physically too. We actually drink the water here in Cambridge, but we're collectively kind of overusing it in a way that's threatening its long-term health. And of course, you know, we know that the natural world, globally speaking, is in trouble. And you know, just like the Cam, we're taking too much out of the natural world, and that's not good for its health. As I'm sure you know, I mean, globally, we operate on a neoliberal model of infinite economic growth, So that means every country, every corporation just has to keep growing economically, endlessly, in fact. But in order to keep going with economic growth, we need to keep buying more stuff. And that means extracting more resources from the natural world to keep all that economic growth going. And the thing is, of course, all this economic growth and resource extraction has pushed humanity's effects on the natural world well beyond what the natural world can actually stand. So that's why we have a whole list of bad things happening, or that's largely why these things are happening: climate breakdown, biodiversity breakdown, sea level rise, ocean acidification, pollution, and all the others. I could go on for a long time, but I won't. Now, you may well have heard of Joanna Macy's idea of the Great Turning. Just in case you haven't, it's the idea that the human race might at some point turn away from the industrial growth society. By that she means the model of endless economic growth, which is essentially kind of killing life on Earth. So she's saying we might turn away from this industrial growth society towards what she calls the life-sustaining society. That's a society in which we look after the natural world and each other, human beings. Now, to me, it seems that a great turning, I think, is definitely happening. Though whether it turns out to be Joanna Macy's, turning towards a life-sustaining society, remains to be seen, I think. Perhaps, rather than the great turning, we could call what's happening now the great unseating. And by that I mean that we as a species, the human race, we're being unseated from our unconscious view that we, the human race, are at the centre of the world, that we are the lords and masters of the earth, that we're in control of the natural world. We're being unseated from that view, perhaps. And I think the pandemic, COVID-19, that's an example of this, I think. The pandemic reminds us that we're not in control of the natural world. It seems likely that the origins and success of COVID-19 have a lot to do with humanity's intrusive and extractivist relationship with the natural world. But the pandemic, with the pandemic, the natural world isn't just flexing its muscles. It's not even doing that. It's compared with what it could do to us. It's a bit like we're living on the back of a giant. Humanity is living on the back of a giant, which is barely awake, but this giant could destroy all of us with its little finger. Now, I mean, to me, all these things seem quite surreal and quite hard to take in. There's a great unraveling, I think, of the natural world, which is happening, it's underway. And then there's myself and Johanna going for a walk on a sunny day in Grantchester Meadows, about to have coffee by the can, all very kind of reassuringly pastoral and English, sort of timeless and safe. And then there's a pandemic. So I've got all these kind of realities at the same time. I personally find it's quite hard to hold in my head. Sometimes seems a bit surreal. Many people have said one ray of light, I think, in this situation with the pandemic, is that it does show what can be done. When enough people really understand that we are facing an emergency, as I'm sure you know, I mean, trillions of pounds kind of appear suddenly from apparently nowhere. A lot of people stay at home for months on end. The economy is turned upside down, people's lives are turned upside down. So it just shows what can be done when we really want to. It's like the seemingly impossible suddenly seems quite easy. So, as I say, all of these things together I find quite surreal. But I do wonder if surreal is the new normal. If perhaps we kind of need to get as used to surreality as we can. But how do we do that? How do we stay grounded when we might be feeling a bit like Alice in Wonderland or Alice through the looking glass? It can seem like a topsy-turvy world, almost dreamlike, but potentially deadly at the same time. Well, I mean, I think on the face of it, what I'm going to be suggesting is probably uncontroversial. because I would suggest that we ground our spiritual practice in reality. I think we need to touch the earth, just like the Buddha did at the time of his enlightenment. But what I think that leads to is possibly a little controversial, because I think that in order to touch the earth in this kind of sense I'm meaning, I think we will need to confront power, human power. And I will say what I mean by that in a moment. But first, what does it mean to ground our spiritual practice in reality? All I mean really is bringing spiritual ideals and practices to real life concrete situations, as the Buddha exemplified. I just mean expressing the Dharma in how we live our lives. But I think bringing our Dharma practice into contact with the earth, with these kind of global issues, I think that means looking at what might seem rather abstract stuff. It's a bit of a paradox. I mean, things like climate breakdown and biodiversity crashing, these things, they're very concrete, real situations, but we mainly know about them through scientific reports of one kind or another. Things like decisions made by politicians and corporations, these can seem, things like trade agreements, laws, economic policies. All of these things can seem a bit kind of nebulous and not much to do with us. But they're very real and have very real effects in the actual physical world. These things are very considerably responsible for why, for example, the rainforests are being cut down so rapidly, why the climate is weirding, why people of low income and people of colour, globally speaking, are so often suffering disproportionately as a result of these things. So, as I say, I think touching the earth in this sense, if we try to look at and reflect on all the realities underpinning our lives, I think when we do that, we find that our practical daily lifestyle is not ultimately ethically or ecologically sustainable. We're supported by, and to an extent, part of an economic and political system which is destroying the natural world. It's at the same time perpetuating and deepening the sufferings of millions of people globally, who are disproportionately people of colour. So I do think, touching the earth, trying to be sort of aware of these global things and incorporate them into our Dharma practice, all this is not easy. And I think we need, to do this, we need all of the Buddhist practices, the whole kind of spectrum, in one form or another, and as appropriate for us as individuals, very individual matter. I think we actually need all the samatha practices, mindfulness, metta, Brahma viharas, for emotional positivity. It is very challenging stuff emotionally. I think we need to probably need to become more conscious of and to deepen our heartfelt response to our ideals of love and compassion, otherwise known as faith, through practices like puja, prostration practice, sadhana, mantra chanting. We need spiritual friendship, community, study and reflection. And I think especially helpful looking at these kind of things, these global realities. I think insight practice is actually very helpful. It can help us accept the situation, but stay in touch with what's actually happening, and not get lost in fear, in papancha, in obsessive thinking and worrying. So I think if we touch the earth in this sense, bringing our understanding of the Dharma to the global and local realities underpinning our lives, then we will need to skillfully speak the truth as we see it. I think that's almost a consequence of turning to look at these things. So I think we'll need to speak the truth as we see it, and in ways appropriate to us as individuals, very much so. But this, I think, might mean speaking as we find, and if appropriate, even calling a spade a spade. Buddhism is not passivity or just being nice, of course. The Buddha himself in the Pali Canon is on record coming into vigorous disputation with Brahmins many times. He is definitely not any kind of wallflower. He called out the caste system, which is definitely not a wallflower thing to do. So I think, skillful challenge of what needs to be challenged is an orthodox and essential Buddhist practice. And this practice, is part of the Yogaratna tradition of spiritual practice. Though in a way, I think it hasn't been very much acknowledged in recent decades, especially in the area of politics. Challenging what needs to be challenged. But there is an example of this happening back in 1984, when Sangharakshita was exhorting his followers to engage in activism against nuclear warfare, against the threat of the nuclear bomb. So I'm actually quote from the talk he gave in 1984. He said, "Pressure can also be brought to bear by the persistent lobbying of members of parliament, by the presentation of petitions, by public meetings, marches and demonstrations, by fasts and solemn vigils, even by love-ins and be-ins. By these and similar means, the government should be left in no doubt as to what the wishes of the electorate really are. If it remains unresponsive to those wishes, or not sufficiently responsive, and the situation is one of extreme urgency, where every day is precious, then more serious measures should be taken, and pressure brought to bear on the government by means of mass civil disobedience along Gandhian lines." Now, that last phrase, I think, for me is quite striking, the mass civil disobedience along Gandhian lines, referring to Gandhi, of course. And that is, that is pretty much what a number of groups, including Extinction Rebellion, have been doing over recent years in particular. Now, I do appreciate this kind of, Dharma, doing activism as a Dharma practice. That this can sound a little bit tiring. It does to me anyway, or possibly even overwhelming. I think, in a way, I'm sort of suggesting that we include speaking out as part of our Dharma practice, but it can seem as if we're adding it on to practicing the Dharma. Practicing the Dharma is a difficult thing to do, of course. Teaching it, building Sangha. People can easily and do sometimes burn out just doing these things, as it were. And I'm not recommending burning out, very much not. Nor am I recommending getting angry, which is a danger of activism, of course. I'm not recommending othering and demonizing politicians or big business, just railing against the bad guys, because they are people too, of course. And nor am I recommending, sort of seeing the future in terms of winning or losing. I think we can get into, either fearing an endless dystopia, sort of the future gone bad forevermore, or kind of longing for an endless sort of eco-heaven in which the bad guys have actually been beaten once and for all. All I'm saying here is that we can't fix samsara, we can't fix the world or end greed, hatred and delusion. And it's important, I think, to when looking at the future, to sort of bear in mind that we really don't know what's going to happen. Reality is complex and just keeps changing endlessly. There's no final victory or defeat. So, there's no winning there's no ultimate winning or losing. But at the same time, I very much recommend not giving up on the world and becoming a bit fatalistic and cold, which I think is a danger with Buddhist practice. I would recommend that we tweak how we see the Bodhisattva ideal and question, what is authentic Buddhist practice in this context that we find ourselves in. I'd recommend, including some kind of direct questioning of business as usual in how we practice the Dharma. I think it's possible that we can sort of suffer from a sort of numbness or a psychological or even spiritual malaise if we don't include these issues in our Dharma practice, if we don't engage with these issues, if we don't really engage with what we know is going on. I also appreciate that it's possible to sort of get a bit numb if you do engage. It's important to engage in ways that work for us as individuals. But on the other hand, I think engaging and speaking out can liberate energy and even joy. And this is something I'm very, very keen on. You know, speaking out can be a joyful thing to do. I'll give a couple of examples sort of from my own life. At one point during the Extinction Rebellion actions in October last year, I sat down to meditate on Horseferry Road in London, Westminster, near the MI5 building. I was supporting a roadblock and I was arrested after a few minutes. Now, for me, this did feel like touching the earth in the ways I've been talking about. You know, I felt a bit nervous at the time, but I also felt very happy and deeply fulfilled to do this, actually. I mean, as I saw it, I was stating publicly that I think some things are very wrong and need addressing urgently. And also, in a way, I was telling the truth as I saw it and sort of contacting reality. And I do see this kind of activity as part of my spiritual practice. I do know, of course, that in risking arrest, in this tactic of risking arrest, I'm using white privilege. I think it's important to say, acknowledge this. It's easy for me in many ways to do this. The police treated me respectfully. And also for me personally, 5 hours in a cell was not a problem. Yeah, I don't like causing disruption, but I do believe that situations can require that to happen. And that the world does change this way. It's not hopeless. Things like, if you turn looking back in history, historically in the UK at least, you know, women getting the vote, people being able to some extent to express their sexuality and gender identity in ways that they want to. I know these freedoms are incomplete and dependent upon where you live in the world, but even these degrees of freedom were won by many ordinary people speaking out over a long time, speaking out again and again. And just one more example from the Extinction Rebellion's actions in October. There are many moments that really moved me. At one point, there were about 20 Buddhists actually sat in the pouring rain on some steps in Trafalgar Square. They were taking part in an occupation of Trafalgar Square, illegally, really. I was sat between a woman called Steph from the London Buddhist Centre, and a woman called Satya from the Pure Land tradition, wearing her robes. And we were just reciting mantras one after the other. And actually there's quite a crowd of, I presume non-Buddhists kind of looking at us and seeming to actually be quite enjoying what we were doing. Now, every mantra meant a lot to me, whether it's Avalokiteshvara or Green Tara or the Buddha or the Maitri mantra. They all meant a lot to me, but so did the people I was chanting with. I knew quite a few of them. My sense of their ethical practice, their heartfelt response to their ideals. So for me, this was activism as Sangha practice. And of course, we were chanting in a very particular context. As I see it, we were standing up for our ideals of wisdom and compassion in a context where I think those ideals really needed to be stood up for. And personally, at that moment, I wasn't worried about the future or anything at all. I just felt very inspired and open and happy, and actually nourished by a spiritual community. So I'm kind of coming towards wrapping up. I do appreciate that street activism is not necessarily your cup of tea, or maybe it is. What I'm suggesting overall that we stay in touch with our spiritual practices, but include in them some form of speaking out that works for us as individuals. Of course, trying to be sensitive to the effects of our words and actions, especially during the pandemic. But I think there's probably many things that we strongly disagree with, many of which have not stopped happening during the pandemic or might even have got a bit worse. And there might also be positive visions of a better world that we wish to promote. So I think skillful speech includes challenging what needs to be challenged, and is an orthodox Buddhist practice. I think we can speak from the heart, from loving kindness and wisdom as far as we're able to. I think this touching the earth that I've been talking about, I think that means turning to face what's going on, globally and locally, but also facing the realities of life and death, of impermanence, the realities of this impermanent, suffering world that we can't fix. I think it means, touching the earth means allowing ourselves to be nourished by the natural world and by our own depths. I think even as we respond and engage with what's going on in the world, I think we can actually deepen our practice, our spiritual practice at the same time. So I think we can touch the earth in all these ways and speak out. So that's, thanks for listening.